Every time my pastor in Oakland hears that I'm going to spend a weekend hanging out with Al Tizon or calling into a Zoom meeting with him and the other infinite legends, he starts to fanboy hard. He gets giddy and starts prodding me with questions about which to garner opinions from Al. How did he evaluate that latest leadership book that just came out? And what's his view about such and such theological conundrum? And what does he think about this sticky public policy issue? And does he have any recommendations for me about this pastoral situation? Marco gets embarrassed and he blushes. He laughs at himself, but he is genuinely stoked to be 1 degree of separation away from Al Tizon. Because he is our executive minister of Serve Globally, the international mission arm of the Covenant Church North America, a role that entrusts Al with setting priorities for our denomination's world engagement and overseeing 125 missionaries and 6 ministries functioning in over 50 countries around the globe. Al may have superstar status among those who have long admired his academic work or been affected by his leadership or trained under his ministerial expertise. But the irony of all ironies is that few humans carry themselves with Al's remarkable humility and approachability. His way of moving in the world is marked by deep listening, genuine pastoral concern, attentiveness to the work of the Spirit, and prophetic power to call out and nurture the best in other people. How can anyone paint a picture of a man who excels and serves in so many diverse roles? Key leader in a growing denomination, professor, academic, husband to Janice, and father to 4, grandfather of 5 now, yes, worship leader, storyteller, Filipino, American, global citizen, lover of God. It is exactly this diverse set of sociological realities and seemingly competing identities that mark the hermeneutic of Dr. Tizon's theological project. His exceptional ability to hold together opposites sets in tension his integral approach, balancing and synthesizing word and deed, evangelism and social action, spirituality and mission. He articulates this vision in his recently published book, Whole and Reconciled: Gospel, Church, and Mission in a Fractured World, named Outreach Magazine's 2019 Resource of the Year in Cross-Cultural and Missional category. One of Al's distinct gifts, his visionary mentorship, comes from his radical commitment to the biblical narrative, his ability to manifest an embodied model of Jesus' teaching in a lifestyle of hospitality, simplicity, mutuality, and selflessness, and his deeply interdisciplinary approach to analysis. A quick story to illustrate. When I started my dual degree program in a master's of theology and economic development at Eastern University, Al served Palmer Theological Seminary as our associate professor of holistic mission, and he served evangelicals for social action, first as holistic ministry director and then as president. I had just returned from a 2-year contract as a missionary practitioner in Brazil with an ecumenical faith-based NGO, where I had firsthand witnessed the bifurcation of spirituality or faith development from social change, entrepreneurship, and community development. I came to the program at Eastern experiencing a dark night of the soul. I was unable to imagine a renewed personal faith that could risk again to believe in the power of Jesus to reconcile a world experiencing suffering. I had reached an untenable place in my faith because I could not find in the church a ministry paradigm that rejected colonial and paternalistic models of mission, the technocracy of the development industry, sexist hierarchies of leadership, or the complicity of development in U.S. foreign policy. And then I met Al. In his teaching and scholarship, he cast for me a vision of mission as real capacity to build God in other people, genuine partnerships of co-working, multi-sector approaches to address spiritual, economic, political, and cultural challenges. And he showed me a hidden history among the networks and partnerships and initiatives of the international mission International Fellowship of Mission as Transformation, INFAMET. These faithful practitioners, particularly from the Global South, embraced mission as complete transformation and the gospel message as holistic change. He traced this more formally in the outstanding book mentioned last evening by Dr. Sider's address, Transformation After Lausanne, Radical Evangelical Mission in Global Local Perspective. And so I got caught up in the embodied example of the Jesus that I desperately wanted to imitate. And so I followed him into Al's footsteps. First with INFAMET as an intern and young scholar, and then into the classroom where I received the best pedagogical training ever by co-teaching a course with him entitled Spirituality and Social Activism. I providentially followed him to the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley, where I completed my doctorate just as he had, and then into my own leadership role as a seminary professor and Covenant Church member. Al's second distinct gift is his emphasis on training up others in the next generation as scholar practitioners, much like himself and those of his INFAMET mentors. He has sought to network and invest in people whose ministerial foci hover near one another, but could exponentially work together to create change through collaboration. As a missionary and development practitioner for 10 years with Action International Ministries in the Philippines, he embraced the way that interlocking aspects of social existence influence human thriving. He fearlessly carried this into his ecclesial work, insisting upon their critical engagement and inclusion in mission among evangelicals. As a Filipino-American, he has led the academy and practitioners in announcing the importance of second-generation churches in the North American context and the profound conflicts and possibilities between generations in immigrant communities, as articulated in his co-edited book from 2012, Honoring the Generations, Learning with Asian North American Congregations. He makes the riches of his scholarly insights accessible to pastors and people in the pews, as demonstrated by his book, Missional Preaching, Engage, Embrace, Transform. In addition to his roles at the Covenant, he also serves as Associate Professor of Missional and Global Leadership at North Park University, where he continues his legacy of catching up future church leaders and young professionals in a gospel-centered vision. He continues exercising his own prophetic voice with INFAMET through truly reciprocal and timely initiatives, such as the 2017 publication of A Call for Biblical Faithfulness Amid the New Fascism. Would you welcome with me mentor, pastor, scholar, visionary, and 2019 ASM president, Reverend Dr. F. Albert Tizon.
Dr. Mandy Kaminsky, come with me everywhere I go so you can introduce me. That was beautiful. I want to meet that guy. Okay. I'm having so much fun. I hope you are too. This is what a great society, a great community to be a part of. Lifestyles of the Rich and Faithful. That's our theme this year, and it is also the title of my address. Now, I'm presuming, rightly or wrongly, that most of us here are rich compared to the rest of the world, and by virtue of our profession, probably also faithful. Now, in this presentation, which is an abbreviated oral version of a much longer paper, I hope to demonstrate that our relative wealth can lead to unfaithfulness in our vocation and ultimately our Lord. But more constructively, I hope to give us a way to align our lives as well as our practice according to an image of Christ among the classes. 8-year-old Jocelyn and I sat on a makeshift bench deep inside the squatter community that she called home. It was Christmas season in the Philippines, so Manila was buzzing with festivities, shopping, gift-giving, and special masses. Carols about snow, roasting chestnuts, and other un-Filipino holiday cheer filled the air. But in the community where Jocelyn lived, life didn't change all that much during Christmas. She asked me what it was like in the U.S. during Christmas. I told her it was much like here in the Philippines, to which she retorted, "You mean what's going on at Mega Mall, don't you?" Mega Mall, located not too far from Jocelyn's squatter community, was as mega imposing a mall as its name implied. Her perceptiveness caught me off guard. She sensed acutely the difference between the experience of Christmas for those who could afford to shop at Mega Mall and those who could not. And furthermore, her comment revealed what she thought of the U.S., namely, that everyone there got to enjoy Christmas, since in her mind, the U.S. was Mega Mall, writ nation large. You know, not everyone is rich in America, I said. And as Christians, Christmas is the celebration of the birth of Jesus, so all Christians get to enjoy Christmas wherever they live. Now, I thought, like a good missionary, that I successfully changed the discussion to the true meaning of Christmas. But Jocelyn was determined to mine the depths of socioeconomic inequality with me. She said sharply but sweetly, "You mean rich Christians can enjoy Christmas, don't you?" Kuya Al, malinaw na malinaw naman. Para sa mayayaman ang Pasko. It's very clear, Brother Al. Christmas is for the rich. Has this little one been reading Marx in school or what? I thought. Her words made a stand. I knew theologically that Jesus came to preach the gospel to the poor. That's what motivated me to return to my homeland in the first place, to live and serve among people like Jocelyn and her family. And yet she concluded from the way Christmas was celebrated every year of her young life that Jesus was for the rich, Christian or not. My theology may have been straight, but she saw what she saw. From her very real concrete view, which I could not deny, Christmas was indeed for the rich. I put my arm around her as I cursed under my breath both the commercialism of Christmas and the cruelty of social injustice. Jocelyn's words have been ringing in my ears for the last 25 years as they have served as a prophetic reminder of the reality of a class hierarchy that defines human existence, as well as the harsh fact that Jocelyn's family is but one of hundreds of millions of families around the world that find themselves on the wrong end of classism, not just during Christmas time, but all the time. What is classism? We need to understand the nature of this ism and to confront it in our lives and in our mission practice. Like sexism and racism, classism distorts perceptions against a group of people, and as such, it justifies the neglect and or the ill treatment and or the oppression of that group. And in the same way that the church loses its missional credibility when it complies or participates in sexism or racism, so too if the church complies or participates in classism. It undermines the preaching of the gospel to the poor or to anybody. Like with racism, sexism, and other injustices, we first intuit the meaning of classism. We feel its evil and empathize with those on the wrong end of it. Our gut knows what it is. Our hearts also know. And to the extent that our minds also grasp it, to the extent that we have a whole being understanding of it, the more poised we are to subvert it and to subvert it more fully and precisely. Now, I consulted other works that attempted to define classism, and they surely helped. But definitions of racism actually proved more helpful, attesting to the inseparable connection between racism and classism. Racism can be defined as prejudice based on differences in physical characteristics, but it is more than personal bias. It is collective prejudice formed into a system of inequality that is undergirded by embedded cultural narratives like popular beliefs or status quo or unchallenged assumptions, stereotypes, etc., regarding darker-skinned people, and then instituted by the powers that be at the expense of those people. Well, if we change a few words, and we also have the definition for classism. Classism is collective prejudice formed into a system of inequality based on socioeconomic stratification, undergirded by embedded cultural narratives concerning the poor, and then instituted by the powers that be at the expense of the poor. Like race, the category of class is a human construct. Social stratification did not fall from the sky. Though it is difficult to pinpoint where the language of class entered into the human lexicon, it was Marx and Engels who not only popularized it, but who also discussed it in terms of struggle between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, thus clearly dispelling any notion of neutrality in class stratification. Furthermore, as we know, they proposed a social order forged by inevitable revolution, wherein economic classes would be abolished altogether, i.e. the birth of socialism from its democratic expressions to communism. Now, lest war break out at the 2019 annual meeting of the American Society of Missiology, that is all I'm going to say about socialism. The important point to grasp from Marx and Engels for our purposes is that the category of class is never neutral. Just like race is a sociocultural construct that has provided rationale for lighter-skinned people to enjoy privilege at the expense of darker-skinned people, class is a socioeconomic construct that has provided the rationale for the wealthiest to be entitled to the highest level of dignity, respect, and privilege, and the poorest to be deprived of such things. And those in between these two strata are people who enjoy gradations of privilege depending on where they land on the social graph. Defining one's worth and determining one's right or access to goods and services on one's socioeconomic status is at the rotten core of classism. Various life characteristics are associated with the category of class, enough that it is insufficient to define it in strictly economic terms. Bloomquist lists occupation, family wealth, educational level, values, aspirations, and cultural and linguistic characteristics as other important factors when considering the meaning of class. A more detailed list would include type and place of residence. Do you own a single-family home in a gated neighborhood or rent a unit in a trailer park outside of town? Mode of transportation. Do you drive a Beamer or take the bus? Musical and artistic tastes. Do you like classical and Rembrandt or reggae and Andy Warhol? Appearance. Are you suited up or untucked and casual? Take a look at yourselves and see where you land on the social graph. The undeniable association to class, however, is race. It is not uncommon in North America, for example, to hear the poor and black or Latino in the same sentence in spite of its political incorrectness. In their study of urban-suburban partnerships, Sider and colleagues assert that the term urban has become code for impoverished people of color, thus demonstrating the close relationship between class and race, classism and racism. Now that said, classism differs significantly from racism and other isms that one can theoretically move from one class stratum to another. Bloomquist observes that class is far more elusive than race or gender, which basically cannot be changed. The ideology of class is that one's place on the class ladder can be changed. Whereas skin color or gender cannot be altered, the rising number of transgenders notwithstanding, all the poor need is a little ambition, a never give up attitude, and a good work ethic to overcome their circumstances. This is where phrases such as upward mobility, I made it to the top, and if you just set your mind to it, you can be anything you want, find their context. But the same context also breeds statements such as, the poor are lazy. When are you going to make something of yourself? And God helps those who help themselves. If the unalterability of the color of one's skin or one's gender traps people into being victims of racism and or sexism, it is precisely the presumed alterability of one's socioeconomic situation that breeds indignity, disrespect, and bias, since in an ideology of class, the poor are poor because of their own doing, or lack of doing, as the case may be. To sanctify this way of thinking about the poor, people often cite Galatians 6:7, believing that the poor have simply reaped what they have sown. The caste system in India, Nepal, and other parts of Asia is the most notorious example of classism, that though it constitutes a significant exception due to a complex combination of family origin, geographical location, function or occupation, darkness of skin, and historically laden notions of what was considered humanly pure and polluted, the caste system determined for centuries the permanent place of people in the social caste structure. Casteism is a case of classism and more, and therefore requires a different kind of analysis than this paper provides. Examples of classism, as we have defined it, include the domestic help system and other forms of indentured servitude in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The list would also include abuses endured by thousands of overseas foreign workers, people from poorer nations who are lured to work in richer nations in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe as cheap laborers. It would also include the place of the poor in North America. Matthew Desmond, author of Evicted, explains, in America, if you work hard, you will succeed. So those who do not succeed have not worked hard. This is an idea found in the marrow of the nation. Based on this deeply held belief in North American culture, the stigmatization is palpable against those who rely on government welfare and food stamps, live in Section 8 housing, have an inconsistent employment record, or all of the above. The homeless, perhaps, epitomize the height of social disdain as they represent within an ideology of class ultimate laziness and or destructive life choices involving some combination of drug use and antisocial behavior. The homeless simply need to change their ways, to repent, for as Stringfellow quipped, when money is an idol, to be poor is a sin. Bloomquist identifies the class structure in North America as a meritocracy, a state system based on aptitude, an allegedly innate quality of potentiality and usefulness in society. Although North American class ideology would claim equality across the spectrum, that is, that everyone has the ability to be anything they want. The existence of college entrance exams to measure aptitude, the dreaded SATs and GREs, suggest otherwise. One's scores can and often do determine not just what school a person attends, but their track in life. In a meritocracy, some people are more equal than others. Bloomquist writes, a meritocracy may fit with the American ethos better than a hereditary aristocracy like the caste system, but classifying people on the basis of aptitude is no less classist. This meritocracy has had an unprecedented opportunity to go worldwide as it has ridden the wave of what we call today globalization, which at least in its economic ideological form is classism on a massive global scale. Have Westerners, inadvertently or not, judged the world's poor on the basis of this meritocracy? Are Westerners systemically classists? More to the point of this study, are Western missionaries systemically classist. Interrogating the log in my own eye, as a missionary who engaged in community development for a decade in my homeland of the Philippines, did I try to implement development strategies that held to the subconscious belief that if the poor just worked hard enough, they can transcend their situation? Am I systemically classist? Such self-scrutiny makes me squirm, which perhaps explains why topics such as kingdom stewardship, material wealth, simple lifestyle, and yes, class prejudice are not conference favorites. Yet the Bible teaches extensively on these matters, so much more than, say, personal morality, sexuality, angels and demons, heaven and hell, or end times. As Sider exclaims, the sheer volume of biblical material that pertains to questions of hunger and justice and the poor is astonishing. Considering Jesus' teachings alone, more than half of his parables and dozens of his direct teachings, including the Sermon on the Mount, the Nazareth Manifesto, and the cleansing of the temple, to name just a few, dealt with economic issues on some level. In light of his birth, life, example, and teachings, Jesus identified with and championed the poor more often than not, with accompanying judgment against the uncaring rich. Let us consider briefly his birth and upbringing. Jesus was born during politically oppressive times. Forced by the requirements of a government census, people had to return to their places of origin to register. Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem, despite Mary being great with child. It was there, in the little town of Bethlehem, in a barn outside the city, because there was no room in the inn, that Jesus was born. Threatened by rumors of the birth of a king, Herod searched for Jesus to destroy him. As Joseph, Mary, and their newborn son went on the run, essentially becoming refugees, Herod, infuriated that he was not informed of the whereabouts of the newborn king, ordered every child 2 years old and under in Bethlehem to be killed. Joseph and family remained as resident refugees in Egypt until Herod died. They eventually resettled in Nazareth, a town whose reputation caused people to ask, can anything good come from that place? There in Nazareth, the Holy Family appeared to be a typical family. The fact that Jesus became a carpenter indicates as much as sons typically pick up the profession of their fathers. In fact, by all indications, Jesus and his siblings grew up as part of a typical Jewish synagogue-going peasant family. Nothing stuck out. Given the place that peasants occupied in the social matrix of ancient Rome, in class language today, Jesus and his family would have been counted among the working class. What difference would it have made if the Son of God was born in a palace under the care of the best medical staff with state-of-the-art equipment? What if, instead of being on the run as refugees from the authorities, Mary, Joseph, and infant Jesus were protected by the state? What if Jesus grew up not in a no-name provincial town, but in a privileged section of a world-class influential city? And instead of learning the ways of the faith by way of village catechesis, what if Jesus was trained in private schools, eventually graduating from the best institutions that Orthodox Judaism could offer? Now, as wild as our imaginations can go here, these are rhetorical questions. That is, we know that the nature of the faith today would have been vastly different if anything of this scenario were true. In fact, in this alternate universe, it's doubtful that anything resembling Christianity as we know it would have come into being. Jesus' brief ministry of teaching, preaching, mentoring, and healing only reinforces the prominent place of the vulnerable or the lower class in the kingdom of God. He had no problem choosing disciples from among the sailors and the despised. He preached and taught regularly in favor of the poor and marginalized. He fellowshiped with undesirables, and he touched and healed the quarantined. As a result, the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to him. Clearly, the poor experienced Jesus as kind, loving, merciful, and powerful. He was their friend who taught in stories to which they could relate, but with authority, unlike the teachers of the law. Among the teachings of Jesus concerning God's identification, solidarity, and defense of the poor, the parable apocalyptic of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25 stands out. Jesus taught famously that those who fed the hungry, gave water to the thirsty, showed hospitality to strangers, clothed the naked, nursed the sick, and visited the prisoners. They did so to him. If that was not Jesus fully identifying with the poor, then nothing was or ever will be. Matthew 25, 31 to 46 depicts in apocalyptic fashion a judgment to come that clearly demonstrates God's heart for the poor. God is on the side of the poor and rewards those who practice compassion and justice among them. But this, of course, only describes the first half of the parable, apocalyptic. The other half describes the opposite. Those who did not care for the hungry, thirsty, stranger, naked, sick, and in prison will be judged, and judged severely. Even though it doesn't specify that the indifferent in the passage were the rich and powerful, the rest of the New Testament witness would strongly suggest that they were. For it was over attention to and pursuit of material wealth in the scriptures that were often blamed for indifference. The thorny soil in the parable of the sower, the rich man and Lazarus, to name a few. Indeed, Jesus leveled his strongest criticisms against the haves and the well-to-dos for their neglect or oppression of the poor. So it is not far-fetched to interpret the second part of Matthew 25 as judgment against the world's elite who did not care for the needy. For inasmuch as you did not do these things, you did not do them unto me. The consequence, according to verse 46, they will go away into eternal punishment. One thing seems perfectly clear from the teachings of Jesus and the early church, that when it comes to matters of faith, material wealth is more a liability than an asset. Wealth was something to be cautious about, something to overcome in order to follow Jesus, something to give away, and something to be willing to abandon for the sake of the kingdom. As Bonk observes, it is clear that Christianity was never designed to make people comfortably at ease with wealth and power. Well, how does one do this, conform to this image of Christ among the classes? How do we operationalize Christ's special concern for the poor in our missionary practice and thus undermine global classism? In reflecting upon the privilege of working with and learning from the poor, both in the Philippines and the United States for the last 30 plus years, I have identified 6 lifestyle-altering movements that have helped me to move closer to how Jesus walked among them. That is, when I submit to these movements in my life and do not resist them. By offering these, I am not at all claiming that I have made it. Far from it. To be sure, I struggle with the rest of the rich and faithful. Nevertheless, these movements to which I refer are these: awakening to compassion, honesty to generosity, accumulation to simplicity, ownership to hospitality, active mission to holistic mission, and contextualization to solidarity. Now, though each of these movements has value in and of itself, my cumulative experience of them has been one of gradation, gears that turn each other upward toward a greater imitation of Christ among the classes, even as I have experienced any given combination of them at different seasons of my life. The 6 movements I'm proposing here make up a single unified movement toward a justice-oriented life, or life reflecting Christ among the classes. So seen in this way, they go from merely being descriptive of independent personal transformations to becoming a unified evaluative tool, which I call for convenience the Christ among the classes inventory. As a tool, the CACI, 6 movements that constitute a unified movement toward justice, can be used to assess where we stand with respect to class relations, commit to growing in economic Christ-likeness, and thus undermine the grip of classism in our hearts as well as in our churches and organizations. A brief description of each of these movements. The first of these movements tracks a progression from awakening to compassion. Liberation theologians have employed the term conscientization to convey what happens among the poor when they realize that their suffering is not simply the misfortune of fate, but a direct consequence of oppressive structures and policies that have advantaged the rich at their expense. The word conveys a process of heightening awareness of their reality and their ability to change it. Now, though Gutierrez and others use conscientization exclusively to describe the liberating process among the poor, it applies just as profoundly to what happens among the rich. For it is the same spirit who conscientizes the poor who also awakens the rich. Awakening among the rich leads to a broken heart and then leads to the beginning of genuine compassion for the poor. Compassion, that weightiness of heart, uncontrollable tears, trembling and sometimes outrage as a result of discovering the suffering of the oppressed, marginalized, and abused, marks the beginning of personal transformation toward economic Christ-likeness. In my own life, heart compassion for the desperately poor overwhelmed me as I sat with a single mother in Limon, Costa Rica in the mid-1980s. While sitting together on the floor of her shack, she described her life of daily struggle, working 12 to 16 hours a day and praying to God for daily bread for her family. At some point in the conversation, her lips continued to move, but I heard nothing but God's Spirit bearing witness to mine that Jesus loved this woman and the billions of her fellow poor around the world, and furthermore, that he wanted his church to care for them. My heart has been broken ever since. This is compassion. This first movement toward economic Christ-likeness, a just life that undermines classism, is an important one, for it tracks an internal move, a work of the Spirit within our spirits, transforming head knowledge of poverty into heart knowledge of the pain and suffering of the impoverished. If this movement has not happened or is not happening, it is difficult to imagine progressing any further on the CACI journey, for any true move of the Spirit in the world begins in the heart. Awakening to compassion generates a second movement, which tracks a progression from honesty to generosity. My awakening not only enabled me to behold, as if in a trance, the suffering of the poor, perhaps for the first time, it also caused me to realize that relative to the rest of the world, I am counted among the rich, whom the Lord cautions or judges throughout the pages of Scripture. Whereas conscientization enables the poor to find in Christ the power to transform their situation, it also pricks the conscience of the rich that can, if we allow it, begin a lifelong process of, quote, selling all that we own and distributing the money to the poor, unquote. Jesus' words here are not metaphorical, as if they are primarily for spiritual application. On the contrary, they have concrete economic implications for the wealthy of the world, which most probably includes all of us in this room. By any objective criterion, Sider asserts, the 4.5% of the world's people who live in North America are an incredibly rich aristocracy living on the same little planet with billions of very poor neighbors. Bonk applies this to the missionary-host relationship and lists the following simple truths. 1, the West is rich. 2, the church in the West is rich. 3, missionaries sent by the Western church are rich. And 4, most of the peoples among whom Western missionaries live and work are poor. One would think that being honest about our wealth would be easy, but we underestimate the power to rationalize or even deny the truth. Granted that, generally speaking, missionaries have distanced themselves from the American dream more than most fellow Westerners, as they have embraced a life of global service, but they are still rich compared to the rest of the world. Our hosts are not wrong when they perceive us as rich just because we come from the West. When we are honest with the fact that we are rich Christians in an age of hunger, we loosen our grip on the wealth entrusted to us and become eager to give it away for the sake of the poor. In other words, we become generous. Now, from works such as Corbett and Fickert's When Helping Hurts and Lupton's Toxic Charity, we know that irresponsible giving can be detrimental to recipients regardless of the good intentions behind it. Kingdom generosity, therefore, cannot be understood apart from good stewardship. Generosity, then, or selling all of your possessions and giving the proceeds to the poor, does not mean an impulsive throwing of $100 bills in the general direction of some impoverished community. It means, rather, a sincere and passionate but carefully thought out desire to contribute to the long-term betterment of the lives of the poor. Lavish but responsible generosity, provoked by honesty regarding our wealth, does its significant part in advancing our journey toward economic Christ-likeness and the subversion of classism. A third movement, I got to get going here, tracks a progression from accumulation to simplicity. Part of the awakening and honesty of our wealth is realizing the materialism that has shaped our lives. As Westerners, we did not one day choose to be materialistic. Our free enterprise advertisement saturated more is better culture has chosen us. Western capitalistic culture breeds materialistic people. Without consciously knowing it, we have bowed the knee to a different God, even as our lips confess Jesus is Lord. As Sider decries, affluence is the God of 21st century North Americans, and the ad man is his prophet. It goes against the grain when we move toward a simpler lifestyle, but it is a definite mark of economic Christ-likeness. I see the aspiration to move from accumulation to simplicity as the step up from the honesty to generosity movement, for it strikes me as inadequate to be generous in our giving, but continue to live in relative luxury. Such generosity may be sincere, but it falls short of the biblical call to give sacrificially. To be truly generous necessitates adopting a simpler lifestyle that is shaped by questions such as, how much is enough? Does our lifestyle reflect our genuine concern for the poor, for the world's poor? How can we lessen the gap between our lifestyles and the lifestyle of those whom God has called us to serve? These are difficult, against the grain questions that nevertheless need to be asked and asked regularly, lest the virus of materialism, consumerism, accumulation, greed infect us over and over again. Materialism is indeed a virus, a sickness that shatters our souls and leaves us empty and in despair. De Graaf and colleagues have identified and brilliantly named this sickness affluenza, which I believe should be listed, if not already, as a real disease with real consequences in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The flu shot to safeguard against it, a conscious, prayerful, deliberate move toward a less cluttered, simpler lifestyle that in turn subverts classism. A fourth movement toward economic Christ-likeness tracks the progression from ownership to hospitality. Unless we challenge it, we believe that we own all that we have accumulated. This belief in private ownership, more often than not, results in the posture of preserve and protect. In stark contrast, Scripture paints a picture of stewardship in which God, creator and owner of all things, has entrusted us the earth's resources to manage and utilize for the sake of the kingdom. This truth turns the Western sense of ownership on its head and calls followers of Jesus to view themselves not as owners of lots of things, but as stewards of God's things. From coins to creation, the call to be good stewards is an integral part of authentic Christian discipleship. I could have easily described this movement as ownership to stewardship, but since the scope of stewardship spans the width and breadth of our lives, I wanted to narrow the focus as we think particularly of undermining classism. I landed on the word hospitality to focus on how we steward our living spaces, our dwellings. That's why I love the story of Casa Adobe. Are our doors open to the needy? Are we hospitable, willing sharers of the blessings of our homes and their contents? After all, we do not own any of it. Our home in Olongapo City, Philippines, was an example, was an open one. It represented for us a compromise to our ideal of living in Tambacan, the city's garbage dump community in which many of our friends and partners lived. For the sake of our children's health, we rationalized. We rented a house with running water and electricity about 2 blocks from Tambacan. In our openness to practice Christian hospitality, our home became a refuge for the sick. My wife was a nurse who really functioned as a doctor. A meeting place for community development groups, a hostel for needy families, a dorm for students, and a center for prayer and Bible study. Our home was perpetually full. Now, I mention this not to pat ourselves on the back, because I am certain that we also failed in many ways to be Christ-like hosts, but to say how much practicing hospitality deepened our faith in God and our relationship with the poor. That experience of shared house or community living in the Philippines has led us as a family to maintain an open-door policy wherever we have lived ever since. Ownership to hospitality, wherein we invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind to be at table together with us, is an essential movement toward economic Christ-likeness and therefore to the dismantling of classism. The next movement tracks an understanding and practice that moves us from active mission to holistic mission. As missionaries, we are committed to a life of action. But what kind of action? I submit that we advance on the CACI journey when we move from being active to being holistically active. Holistic mission goes by other names, such as integral mission, mission as transformation, and word, deed, and sign. But essentially, it refers to an approach to mission that is based on a robust theology of the kingdom of God, and as a result, it strives to address the full gamut of human need: spiritual, psycho-emotional, social, physical, and environmental. The implications of a holistic approach to the subversion of classism should be self-evident, in that working together with the poor, not just for them, to alleviate their hardship, creates a bond between them. There are many approaches to fight poverty together, and they are often lumped together under the umbrella of relief and development ministries, but poverty is multidimensional, and holistic ministry addresses it multidimensionally. The point is, working side by side with the poor in addressing the full gamut of human need plays a significant part in subverting classism around the world. We consider, lastly, the movement from contextualization to solidarity. Solidarity being the pinnacle of reflecting Christ among the classes. And the road to solidarity with the poor begins with a commitment to contextualization. Definitions and synonyms abound for contextualization, but I lean toward an understanding of it that conveys a reciprocal process wherein missionaries and their hosts learn together how best to express the transcultural faith in radically local ways by committing to full engagement with one another. This means immersing into the community to which God has called them to serve, which entails fully engaging in the lives of the people relationally and culturally. This is in contrast to an arm's length, aloof, I don't need to learn the language approach. Contextualization then ultimately refers to full immersion, that is, to incarnational life and ministry. What does it look like to live incarnationally among the poor? It involves immersion into their culture, sharing in both their joys and struggles, families and friends, their life ways, and vice versa, allowing them to share in both our joys and struggles, families and friends, and our life ways. Inspiring examples of the faithful who pitch their tents among the poor include Viv Grigg, who is among us, Benigno Beltran's work with the residents of Smoky Mountain, who is also among us, Ash and Angie Barker's ministry with the people of Klang Toi in Bangkok, John and Vera Mae Perkins' seminal work in development and reconciliation as they return to Jackson, Mississippi, and Jean and Joy Thomas's ministry among the rural poor in a remote village in Haiti, all of whose published stories attest to both the challenges and rewards of incarnational ministry. Genuine incarnational life naturally moves toward a posture of solidarity with the poor. That is, a commitment to joining them in the struggle for justice. Incarnational life moves to solidarity when missionary and host work together for the betterment of the whole. Living in community together is one thing, but for missionaries and hosts to join the blood, sweat, and tears struggle for peace and justice defines Christian solidarity. The two Jesuit priests in the 1986 film The Mission exemplify solidarity. Though each of them chose a different path, Father Mendoza, played by De Niro, went the way of armed resistance, and Father Gabriel, played by Irons, the way of nonviolence. They both demonstrated deep companionship, commitment, and sacrifice with the indigenous church in its struggle against injustice. This is solidarity. For a real-life example, when missionaries and Filipino church leaders banded together to participate in the People Power Revolution that toppled a corrupt president in the Philippines in the mid-1980s, they demonstrated Christian solidarity. In my own denomination, there's a story of missionary Dr. Paul Carlson, who was shot and killed during the Simba Rebellion of 1964 in the Congo because he chose to remain in the country to care for the wounded. His words, "I will not leave," demonstrated solidarity with the Congolese in the chaos of war. These examples reflect full maturity and economic Christ-likeness. We can go no further on the journey. Solidarity with the poor rings the death knell of classism. Our consciences have been awakened to compassion. We have come to grips with our wealth that has made us lavishly but wisely generous. We've become aware of the disease that has cluttered our lives with things, and that awareness has caused us to pursue a simpler lifestyle. We have realized that our sense of ownership has created a posture of preserve and protect instead of manage and utilize for the sake of the kingdom. And that realization has caused us to loosen our grip and grow in our hospitality. We have sharpened and broadened our practice of the world, moving from simply being active to embracing truly holistic approach to mission that addresses the full gamut of human need. And we have committed to an incarnational life among the poor, which has led us to be in sacrificial solidarity with them. Each gear-like movement generates the next, as they move us toward a unified upward movement of greater and deeper economic Christ-likeness. And to the extent that we are moving in this direction, we effectively dismantle classism in our lives. Now, I propose these 6 movements within a movement as an assessment tool, a kind of inventory of our own orientation and our relationship with the poor and the rich. But I hope that it doesn't just serve it's not just a personal justice audit. May it also prove useful for churches and mission organizations to assess their class relations. And I'm just going to go quickly because of time with some organizational considerations that challenge classism. The first is this book that wrecked my life last year when I read it, a book by Scott Bessner called Overturning Tables. He talks about this Christian industrial complex. I changed the word Christian to missionary because I combined Christian industrial complex and the way we use missionary enterprise, which isn't that different. And so I put them together, and he really talks about the missionary industrial complex. And he talks about how the modern missionary movement really began to grow at the same time that the corporation, the idea of the corporation began. And it was troubling to read this. If you want to wreck your life or your organization's life, read this book. It's difficult not to be troubled by such insights, but it's important. And what he calls for is really starting over. And that until we are courageous enough to do that, there are some more modest proposals that I have for us. This is the quote that I pulled from his book that I thought was just brilliant. We are more than the business we have become. I urge us to look at our fundraising approaches. I really believe that we need to revisit our approaches to fundraising. We must avoid what has been called by those crassly inclined poverty porn. We must ask ourselves, if we were the beneficiaries of a project, how would we want to be described and viewed by potential donors? I also talk about just standards for financial support and lifestyle. The missionary support levels that we expect are often based on Western living standards. What would happen, I ask in the paper, if we were to begin to base our missionary support level expectation, base it on the living standards of the place where God has called us to serve? I know it's more complicated than that, but what if we started with that question? And then I talk about missionary bonding. I'm assuming that we're familiar with this concept that Betty Sue and Tom Brewster introduced to us to the missionary world about 40 some years ago, maybe longer. Borrowed from the animal world and said that, as a newborn the newborn bonds with what it first sees, and it was really important for the Brewster said, missionaries are like newborns, being born into a new culture, and it's so important that their first encounter are not fellow missionaries, but those of the host culture. Also talked about ethical guidelines for hired help. I just want to read a little bit of that. It's not uncommon for missionaries to hire helpers to clean their houses, do their laundry, tend their gardens, drive them around, take care of their children. Should there be ethical guidelines for this practice? In fact, in some places, should organizations discourage the practice? In the Philippines, for example, the katulong system, where middle or upper middle class Filipinos avail of the services of the lower class, often from their own provincial families, to do the dirty work, is part of the fabric of Filipino society. These katulongs are not protected by any laws with regard to wages, time off, and work or living conditions. Consequently, many katulongs suffer tremendous abuse. Such a system is certainly not limited to Philippine society, as serfdom exists in many forms throughout the world. But I personally know the Philippine katulong system all too well. If anyone knows my brother's work, Thomas Alex Tizon's work on our family, you would know that we know that this system very well. In a culture such as this, what message does it send when missionaries benefit from a system that is thoroughly and utterly classist? And then lastly, theology and practice of just partnerships. We talk the language of partnerships, but we are far from seeing them as a basis of equality. We're far from that, and we need to come up with theologies of partnerships that truly foster an equality, the way God sees us. So in conclusion, Miguel de la Torre described sexism, racism, and classism as the three prongs of Satan's pitchfork. In the pursuit of justice, as part of its mission, the church strives to champion the cause of women, marginalized peoples, and the poor, which are often intertwined and interrelated. Three injustices, one pitchfork. In the complexity of these oppressions, the church often finds itself struggling to be more effective in addressing the tangled web of issues. Now, from my own experience of the pitchfork, the prong of classism has posed the most complicated set of issues, but also from my own experience, it has been challenged the least. Because the values of the American dream constitute the air we breathe and the water we drink, we carry with us most often, unbeknownst to us, classist assumptions to our countries of service. In this paper, I have attempted to reawaken the Western Church in mission of the need to confront classism and have offered a way to assess ourselves and our organizations based on an image of Christ among the classes. Modern-day prophets have arisen in our generation, many of whom I have cited in this study. They have championed the cause of the poor and have urged the wealthy to beware of the idolatrous power of mammon. But I am not sure how well the global church in mission has taken heed. Shiny, celebrity-centered entertainment as worship megachurches around the world continue to proliferate. The prosperity gospel continues to gain adherents. The poor get poorer and the rich get richer, even where Christianity is growing. Talk of redistribution of resources, simple lifestyle, and sacrificial generosity still met with defensiveness and anger in many Western churches. I have added my small voice to the handful who have decried classism, for the integrity of the church and its mission depends on how thoroughly we have exorcised it from our personal and collective souls, and how well we have loved the poor. For Christ among the classes reminds us that inasmuch as we have loved the hungry, the thirsty, the immigrant, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner, we have loved him. Amen.